In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. Malcolm X believed in the existence of God, Allah. And for him it was a matter of faith. He took an oath called Shahada, and he never broke his oath. He lived by his faith. Recently, a student came to me and said that he was troubled because he could not strengthen his faith in the existence of God, because he could not for himself prove that God existed. My question to him was how he was going about proving the existence of God, because proof of God's existence cannot be demonstrated by use of our five senses, logic, nor the scientific method. Our five senses, along with logic and science, make it even impossible for us to be 100% certain about the nature of our material world, let alone the existence of God. They are indeed three blind guides. There are reasons why none of those methods of experiencing nature can mediate the divide between us and God. It is an undeniable fact that we cannot draw 100% certain conclusions about the structure and function of anything in the material world. We cannot know the nature of the material world because of a constant time delay between our sense impressions of it and the qualitative changes things continually undergo. One truly cannot step twice into the same stream, as was said by a great philosopher. Our understanding of the sources of our sense impressions is never accurate. What we experience is analogous to a person who is trying to define the nature and structure of a thick, rapidly moving, continually changing, and unending fog. We simply don't have immediate knowledge of the nature of anything material. Each of us thus suffers from a persistent learning defect. That fact compels us all, whether we like it or not, to conclude that we suffer from a perpetual defect of reasoning about everyone and everything in our lives. Remember the proverb, and I quote, "To err is human," end quote. For that reason, we are reduced to guessing about nature at best concerning everything we claim to know, including ourselves. Even more so, our persistent defect of reasoning arising out of time-delayed sensations are equally matched by thousands of defective ideas we construct in our minds and which we project onto material things, including ourselves and other people. In short, the ideas we have of people and things imperfectly match the things or people we ascribe them to. For that reason, each of us are more or less always struggling to overcome the damaging effects of ignorance. I often think of what Jesus, peace be upon him, said, and what he meant when he said, and I quote, "They are the blind guides leading the blind," end quote. The Holy Quran states, and I quote, "Their example is that of one who kindled or lit a fire, but when it illuminated what was around him, Allah took away their light and left them in darkness. They could not see, deaf, dumb, and blind. They will not return," end quote. In the natural world, sense impressions, logic, and the scientific method are like blind guides leading blind souls. A blind soul is a soul that does not continually reflect the light of God onto the mind's eye in this life. But even though they are inadequate tools to inform us of what is natural and demonstrate to us the existence of God, that does not mean that we should reject our sensations, logic, and the scientific method. They do have a limited usefulness. We should not reject them because they provide us with the raw materials out of which we can increase our rational capacity, refine our use of logical thinking, and our ability to practice the scientific method in order to analyze experiences within our limited natural context as best we can. The problem is that each sensation we have of things is mismatched through our perception of those things in our consciousness and in our memories, and thus what we sense should always be shaded by a healthy degree of skepticism. More often than not, we cannot understand our sensations. From those facts come the following. Since we cannot know the nature of our material existence by means of our five senses, then neither can we know the existence of God with certainty by our five senses, by logical reasoning, and or by use of the scientific method. No matter how precise the scientific instruments we use are or become in the future, they are or will never be precise enough to correct our defective reasoning about the things and people around us in the here and now. In other words, we are unable to know existence in its present tenseness. At best, those two means of collecting and analyzing sense impressions can only yield to us reasons by one, analogy, or two, reasons by logical deduction and or induction. Both are necessarily limited to yielding uncertain inferences about the existence of God, because God is not a thing nor a person within the context of our natural lives. Such kinds of inferences never yield absolute certainty on the question whether or not God exists. Therefore, since we cannot say for certain God exists, no more than we can say for certain God does not exist, we are forced to infer only two statements about the existence of God. We can infer that one, there is a chance that God does not exist, and that two, there is a chance that God does exist. Logically, it is impossible for both of those statements to be false at the same time, because they are statements of chance or probability, not statements of 100% certainty. But they can give to us some hope, because we at least can know logically that they cannot both be false. The two possibilities are that either only one is logically true or both are logically true. If you think about it, then, that amounts to a 50% chance that both God does and does not exist. The reasons for that are as follows. Since they are particular statements of chance, it is logically impossible for both of those statements to be false at the same time. They cannot logically be false at the same time, because if we assume that both there is a chance that God exists and two, there is a chance that God does not exist to be false statements, then we would be logically compelled to conclude that it is logically impossible for God to exist. That would mean there is no hope or basis for having credible faith in the existence of God. On the other hand, if the statements there is a chance that God exists and there is a chance that God does not exist are assumed to both be true statements, then what arises is a paradox. The resolution of that paradox can only be resolved out of the box, thinking out of the box, and by concluding that we are not seeking proof of God in the right way. Out of the box here means that there must be a supernatural way to know with certainty that God exists. Therefore, it must be that both statements are logically true statements. I reemphasize logically true statements, understanding the limits of logic, especially if we are to keep in mind that there is no material evidence to compel with absolute certainty the belief that God exists nor that God does not exist. That puts us right back where we started. We are left with intellectual uncertainty about the existence of God based upon our sensations, based upon logical reasoning, and based upon the scientific method. Of course, if the proposition that God does not exist is true, then disbelief in God does not pose a moral problem for those who choose to disbelieve in the existence of God. For such persons would be intellectually free to make up mythologies and standards of right and wrong, which serve their purposes based solely upon their individual circumstantial needs. That is one path at the fork in the road. Likewise, if the proposition that God does exist is true, then belief in the existence of God would pose no problem for a person who holds such a belief in good faith, without use of their five senses, without use of logic, and without use of the scientific method. That would be the other path in the fork in the road. But there's more to it. Belief in the existence of God would pose social problems for such a person having good faith in the existence of God. A believer in the existence of God would face both moral and physical challenges which would arise from such a person acting socially and morally as though God does exist. Social consequences would follow because they would be acting socially in relation to both, one, those who believe as they do, and two, those who disbelieve in the existence of God. For example, there would be unending social and political tension and friction between the two divergent groups, that is, the believers and disbelievers, because one group would want to formulate laws which are relative or circumstantial and exclusive, while the other group would want to formulate laws which are universal and inclusive. The two divergent groups would necessarily be diametrically opposed socially and morally, with no possible resolution of conflict between them. Each group acting exclusively on their beliefs would cause diametrically different global consequences for humanity and the planet Earth itself if one group or the other had the absolute power to impose its will. So, we must dismiss any attempt to prove the existence of God by material means such as our five senses, by logic, and by the means of the scientific method. Yet, proof that God exists is accessible to each of us in the right way. I am reminded of the beautiful verse in the Holy Quran, and I quote, "Guide us on the right path," end quote. Such proof is neither by means of our senses, by means of logical reasoning, nor science, but every person in different cultures and of high and low social standing do have an equal inherent potential power to prove the existence of God within themselves, independently of sense impressions, logical reasoning, textual authority, and natural science. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.